Can I call Captain William Raldis to the podium, please, from the Commanding Officer of Southern Station. Captain Raldis will read the citation for Captain Oberzier, Sergeant Walter Ware, Sergeant Liberta, Officers Barnes, and Officer Costa.
Good evening. On July 12, 2013, Captain Tim Overzier, Lieutenant Dave Johnson, Sergeant Walter Ware, Sergeant Ron Liberta, Officer Chris Costa, and Officer Cody Barnes responded to a 911 call of shots fired at 888 Brandon. Captain Overzier, along with Lieutenant Johnson and Sergeant Ware, were 1 block away from the call when they heard of shots fired. Captain Overzier, Lieutenant Johnson, and Sergeant Ware started their response immediately with minimal information due to them being so close to the scene. Captain Overzier, driving, took a slow and methodical approach because they did not know if the shooting was inside or outside on the street of 888 Brandon. As they approached 888 Brandon, initially they did not see anything out of the ordinary. All of a sudden, Sergeant Ware observed a subject, later identified as Barry White, walk out from the loading dock on 888 Brandon. Sergeant Ware observed blood on the front of White's clothing. Sergeant Ware immediately yelled to Captain Overzier and Lieutenant Johnson, "Stop the car. I have a guy with blood." Captain Overzier stopped the vehicle, and they all exited the vehicle to immediately make contact with the subject. Lieutenant Johnson and Sergeant Ware made contact with White first, as Captain Overzier took a cover position. Sergeant Ware started to ask White general questions, and he received no response from White. White stood in front of Sergeant Ware, just staring through him and not answering any questions. Sergeant Ware then asked White if he was hit, at which time White replied, "Yeah." Captain Overzier, Lieutenant Johnson, and Sergeant Ware, from the brief interaction with White, sensed that White was a possible suspect in the shooting and was a threat to them. They all immediately drew their weapons and gave White verbal orders to get on the ground. White initially cooperated by bending down to the knee on the ground, but then suddenly stood up, turned his back on the officers, and fled into Taqueria Dos Amigos Mexican restaurant, which is located on the street level of 888 Brandon. Lieutenant Johnson and Sergeant Ware immediately pursued White. As Johnson and Sergeant Ware pursued White into the restaurant, they reached the doorway and observed White inside the restaurant facing them in a standing shooting position with a gun pointed towards them. Lieutenant Johnson and Sergeant Ware immediately took cover to the left of the restaurant on the building line. Sergeant Ware attempted to alert Captain Overzier that White was in the restaurant with a gun, but Captain Overzier did not hear him. Captain Overzier proceeded to run into the restaurant, but when he reached the front door, he saw White standing behind the counter with his arms extended, holding a gun in his hand in a shooting position. White fired his gun, attempting to kill Captain Overzier. Captain Overzier observed numerous customers inside the restaurant and at risk. They were in his line of fire, so he was unable to engage White. Captain Overzier immediately veered to his right out of the front door of the restaurant and took cover. Captain Overzier then immediately broadcasted over PIC radio that shots had been fired at officers. As Captain Overzier was putting out additional information over the PIC radio, he observed 2 police cars driving east on Brandon Street toward the location. The first car was being driven solo by Sergeant Ron Liberta, and the second car was being driven by Chris Costa with his partner, Officer Cody Barnes. As Sergeant Liberta arrived on scene, Captain Overzier saw White's arms extend out of the restaurant's front area of the building, and with his arms extended and the gun in his hands, Captain Oberzier attempted to warn the responding officers that White was lying in wait for them, but that he could not get the information out over the air. Captain Oberzier, Officer Costa, and Officer Bonds observed White fire his gun at Sergeant Liberta as he arrived on scene attempting to kill him. It was later determined that White shot at Sergeant Liberta 3 times. Sergeant Liberta drove past the location, exited his vehicle in a safe place, and took cover. Officer Costa and Barnes were driving behind Sergeant Liberta, and when they saw White fire his weapon on Sergeant Liberta, Officer Costa stopped his marked Chevy Tahoe in the street in front of the taqueria. Officer Costa and Barnes immediately exited their vehicle to engage White. As they exited their vehicle, White fired his weapon upon them twice, trying to kill them. Officer Costa and Barnes were not able to engage White due to the numerous innocent bystanders behind him. Officer Costa and Barnes took positions of cover, waiting for their opportunity to engage White when they observed him start to walk towards the street away from the restaurant with his hands up. Officer Costa and Barnes continued to have their guns sights on White when he proceeded to walk towards the street and lie on his stomach and give up. Sergeant Liberta, Officer Costa, and Barnes immediately took White into custody. White's firearm was located on the curb line in front of him. Further investigation revealed that prior to attempting to kill Captain Oberzier, Lieutenant Johnson, Sergeant Ware, Sergeant Liberta, Officer Costa, and Officer Barnes, White had gone into Victoga Jewelry Store at 888 Brandon Street and killed 2 people and severely wounded others. White's vehicle was also located about 30 feet from the door of 888 Brandon Street. Inside the vehicle was a loaded AK-47. The quick response by all these officers prevented White from getting back to his vehicle to retrieve his loaded AK-47 and more likely make this incident worse than it was. The quick response, action, and bravery of Captain Oberzier, Lieutenant Johnson, Sergeant Ware, Sergeant Liberta, Officer Costa, and Officer Barnes prevented Barry White from killing them or any other people on July 12, 2013. For their actions, they received a Silver Medal of Valor.